Hi everyone, welcome back to English 116. This is for our class for Monday, the 4th. And as you know, I was feeling a little bit under the weather last class, so I ended up posting a video from the past. And then my pug ended up feeling a bit under the weather, so it's been quite the week, a little bit behind with the discussion forum responses, but I will be catching up. And today I wanted to finish up the fiction section by talking about Battle Royal, which I didn't have a chance to discuss thus far, and also introduce the drama section. So, Battle Royal happens to be the first chapter of a novel entitled Invisible Man. Not The Invisible Man, but Invisible Man. And it is perhaps the best novel ever written, in my opinion, which is pretty high praise. And it is long. It is over 400 pages long. One of the reasons why we're not reading it in class. But at least we can read the first chapter, which was published as a standalone short story. So it stands on its own. But in order to truly understand this chapter, you need to have read the book. I'm going to try to summarize the book. Understand this is quite superficial. I hope at one point you get to read the book. The book begins with the prologue, and in the prologue, we have a narrator who calls himself an invisible man. And he says that he's invisible because no one sees his individuality. They merely see his race, and he is black. Keep in mind the time period in which this piece was published, 1947, and what it would mean to be black in 1947. And what this narrator has done is he's broken into an all-Caucasian neighborhood that he would never be allowed to live in because of the color of his skin. And he breaks into a basement where he is currently surrounded by darkness, but he has rigged up hundreds of electric lights. So he is surrounded by light as well as darkness. Light and dark is a major theme in the novel. And he is stealing the electricity or stealing power from the power company. And that's very symbolic about the idea of who has power. And he says that he needs to reflect back on his youth in order to explain how he became an invisible man. And that it all began with his graduation from high school. So that's the prologue. And then we get the first chapter, which is where we find out that Invisible Man has graduated from high school and has given a speech that has received so many accolades that he's been asked to deliver it to the leading white citizens of the town. An Invisible Man goes to do that very eagerly, finds out that it's all been a setup, that he's there basically to provide brutal entertainment for those in residence, that a literal boxing match has been set up, and that he has to fight against other black individuals. And after the battle is over, all the Invisible Man can think about is that perhaps I'll be able to deliver my speech, despite the fact that he's been beaten and humiliated. Even prior to the battle, a naked woman was paraded out, and all of the young boxers have to see this woman. At the time, it would be a crime to look at a white woman if you were black. And because the boxers are wearing only boxing shorts, their excitement, their physical excitement is very evident. So that's one of the ways in which they're tortured. And then after they find out that the boxing match is fixed, so that the strongest boxer of all is basically fighting against Invisible Man. Invisible Man tries to fix the fight with the strongest boxer. The strongest boxer refuses, saying that basically this is the only way that he can gain some sort of sense of dignity and achievement is by winning this horrific boxing match. Then the men are supposed to be paid, and it turns out that they all have to scramble for money on an electrified rug, which illustrates again this idea of power and who has it and who doesn't. And when the men try to scramble for the coins, they realize that the coins are fake, so the compensation is fake. And then Invisible Man gets to deliver a speech, and no one's really paying attention until Invisible Man makes an error and says, instead of social responsibility, says social equality. The room comes to a halt, and then, of course, he's asked to take back his words, which he does. He says he's swallowing blood, and he's, quote, rewarded, unquote, by being given a scholarship to the local college. However, the Invisible Man has a terrible dream that night of his grandfather, and we're told about the grandfather at the beginning of the story, who always haunts Invisible Man. And the grandfather and Invisible Man are at a circus. Invisible Man is unsure why he's having this dream. That, in fact, is going to be your attendance question today, is asking you, what do you think the dream is about and its significance? Where Invisible Man is with his grandfather refuses to laugh at the clowns, and grandfather basically tells Invisible Man that he's going to be kept running. The way the novel proceeds, so that I can summarize the novel for you, for the first 100 to 200 pages, Invisible Man does go to that college with the scholarship he's been presented, and he finds out that everything has been fixed, that even though education presents itself as a vehicle for opportunity and equality, that is not going to be the experience of Invisible Man because he's black. So then in the next 100, 200 pages, he decides that what he needs to do is to try to change the system politically, which has been rigged against the disenfranchised and people of color. So he goes into politics. And after, again, about 100 to 200 pages, he realizes the political system is just as fixed as the educational system. And Invisible Man will never be given opportunity because he's black. And then Invisible Man meets a character who has a quite telling name, Ross the Destroyer. And Ross believes in destruction. And he tells Invisible Man that the only way basically to enact change is through dismantling all of the systems that exist and basically destroying everything and starting afresh, which Invisible Man does with Ross the Destroyer, or attempts to do. And then a huge riot ensues in their own community. And as Invisible Man is watching the destruction around him, he realizes that's not the answer either. All he's doing is hurting his community and hurting himself. So Invisible Man decides that he needs to hibernate. Keep in mind what hibernation means, that you go to sleep, but then you awaken. And he ends up breaking into a basement in an all-Caucasian neighborhood that is filled with darkness, but Invisible Man sets up hundreds of lights that he steals from, or the electricity that he steals from the electric company or the power company. In other words, the novel ends the way it begins. And the Invisible Man is surrounded by darkness, yet light, as he's stealing power and hibernating, contemplating what to do next. So that gives you a little bit of an idea of the novel, which is somewhat foreshadowed in Battle Royal. And again, we have to remember that this is an adult narrator who's reflecting on his youth. So this is very much a coming-of-age story, almost like Young Goodman Brown. And we're introduced to the grandfather, and Invisible Man talks about that on the grandfather's deathbed. The grandfather calls himself a spy in the enemy's country, and that he's lived his life with his head in the lion's mouth, and the instructions are to overcome him with yeses. This is quite telling because basically grandfather on his deathbed is able to tell the truth, and basically that the truth is that he's only pretended to be meek and accepted a subservient position in society, that he basically has been a spy in the enemy's country. Think about what a spy does, is that they basically gather recognizance in order to overthrow. And that's what the grandfather's been doing by appearing to be passive and meek in Caucasian society. That he's lived with his head in the lion's mouth, that racism is the lion and the Caucasian society is the lion. And to overcome him with yeses, to pretend to be humble in order to be able to overthrow the system. But Invisible Man doesn't understand that yet. He learns this through his experience with delivering his speech and many other experiences that follow as we find out as the novel progresses. And that he, Invisible Man, has been asked to deliver his graduation speech to the leading citizens of the town. And notice they're all male, and they are all Caucasian because these are the individuals who are in power. So this piece is as much about gender as it is about race, as we see how the woman is treated much like a piece of meat for the entertainment of the men. And the men enjoy humiliating and brutalizing blacks. And yes, the N-word is used in this piece. It is very problematic, but I think it illustrates the historical time period we're in. And that naked blonde, as I had talked about, who is objectified, tellingly has a tattoo of an American flag. And in other words, she's supposed to be symbolic of America itself, that they can look, but they can't touch. Um, and that basically she is a mirage for them. Note all the black and white imagery when you're reading the piece. It's one of the reasons why I think the novel is so superb, is because it reads like a short story. Great attention to detail in every sentence, which was both wonderful and terrible for the author, Ralph Ellison. The novel was an instant sensation. Ralph Ellison was quite young when he wrote it, however, so there were all kinds of expectations about what would come next. And nothing came next. It almost reminds me of Orson Welles, that he peaked very young, and that if Ellison, that is, Ralph Ellison, had peaked in his later years, I think he would have received a great amount of respect and accolades. Instead, there was this sense of, well, what are you going to do? And he didn't live up to that expectation. But nevertheless, the black and white imagery from the men wearing the tuxedos that are black and white, from the men consuming the black cigars, much like they are consuming the black men, the white tissue paper that this scholarship is wrapped in. And of course, not only is a tissue paper very thin and insubstantial and easily ripped, but this tissue paper is white to illustrate how empty the dream is that he's being presented with. The scholarship is presented in a briefcase. A briefcase represents industry, it represents professionalism, it represents success, all of the things that will be denied to Invisible Man purely because of the color of his skin. The boxing match serves as a wonderful symbol and metaphor for the societal battles that people of color and the disenfranchised have to fight every day, where they literally have to fight each other for crumbs, or rather than truly fighting against those in power. We could say something similar exists in our current times from an economic perspective. The 99% fighting against each other for a little bit of profit, while the 1% has an enormous amount of wealth. The other boxer, Tatlock, talking about that, no, he refuses to fix the fight because, as he tells Invisible Man, when Invisible Man asks, why are you doing this for them? And Tatlock responds, for me, you son of a bitch, that this is really the only way to get any kind of dignity or respect in a system that has been completely rigged. The fake payment, the tokens on the electrified rug, as I was indicating, that everything is a lie. And of course, those in power are hurting those who do not have power, as we see with the power of the electrified rug. And then when he finally gives a speech, again, Invisible Man, all he cares about is giving his speech. He believes that he can somehow convince this audience that he's superior to others. Of course he can't. And of course, as Invisible Man acknowledges, he's not superior to others of his community. He just thinks he's superior to others of his community, that they're all degraded and humiliated in the same way. And when he says, aka mistakenly, social equality rather than social responsibility, everything comes to a halt. Now, if you believe in Freud and psychology, there is no such thing as a misstatement. It's just a personification or a representation of one's subconscious. So one could say that social equality is the way that Invisible Man is trying to rebel against the system. Keep in mind that Invisible Man is blinded with white blindfolds, again, the black and white imagery, but he peeks outside of the blindfold. So this shows a level of subversion here. And it continues on when Invisible Man talks about how he tries to protect the naked blonde by toppling one of the men in the chairs. I mean, this could lead Invisible Man's death. So ultimately, we see glimpses of Invisible Man understanding, or at least on some subconscious level, accepting the fact that he is at a disadvantage and needs to fight, much like the grandfather has suggested. That dream of the grandfather at the circus, it's a lot of negative foreshadowing of what's going to happen next. I don't want to talk too much about the dream. We can talk about it next class. But I'm curious to know, what do you think that particular dream signifies when the grandfather refuses to laugh at the clowns. Invisible Man and grandfather are at a circus, and Invisible Man is instructed by grandfather to open up an envelope, which is one envelope after another, and then it says, "To whom it may concern, keep the Zen boy running." So, I wanted to move forward to talk a little bit about drama, which is our next unit, while I hope you are contemplating some of the possibilities for your first paper. Now, reading drama is a very different sort of exercise than reading short story, in part because dramas were never meant to be read. They were meant to be performed. And that means when we are in the drama section, we are going to watch performance. Ideally, we would watch a live performance. Logistically, that's too difficult, so we're going to have to rely on film, which is not necessarily a bad thing considering this is a literature and film class. But as we've talked about, watching film is different. When you're watching a live drama, you're not looking through the lens of a camera. So the camera person is incredibly important in terms of film. And also, with film, we have all kinds of liberties that you might not necessarily have on a live stage. So, you have the possibility of utilizing things like special effects and outdoor scenes that you wouldn't necessarily be able to do on a stage itself. We have to think about that. Now, watching a performance is in no way a substitute for reading the performance, because even though dramas were meant to be performed, these particular dramas that we are watching are pieces of literature, much like the short stories we read, and much like when we watch Citizen Kane. So the idea is that when we read it, we can get new meaning and new nuance in a way that we wouldn't just watching it be performed, especially if we were watching a live performance where there wouldn't be a possibility of rewatching in the way there is with film. So, some suggestions when you're reading drama: you have to read those stage directions very carefully because these are the only clues of how the drama was meant to be performed. That said, the stage directions will be in italics, so you're likely to want to skip them. You have to pay very close attention to the names of the characters, and when you're reading a drama, the names of the characters will be on the left-hand side in italics. You might be tempted to just read the dialogue, but if you do that, you'll get confused. So you have to very clearly visualize who is speaking. And again, you don't necessarily have to do this when you're watching a drama because you get to watch the actors performing the roles. So you get to see particular individuals with different appearances and different wardrobe reading the lines. And you don't have that luxury when you're reading a drama. Chances are my most common experience with drama is through television. And the textbook talks a little bit about that, about the ways that it's similar to and different from seeing a live performance. The example they give you actually happens to be from a television show in the heyday of television in the 1990s. This would be before the internet and all of the possibilities that the internet offered us for different modes of entertainment and for streaming. The TV show you might have heard of is Seinfeld, and they give you an example from the script. And I actually, in the notes below, have given you a very brief video from a small piece of the script. The script is from an episode called The Pitch. I don't know if any of you have ever seen Seinfeld before. I don't know if any of you have ever seen The Pitch before. I think it's quite illustrative that if you've obviously had some experience with Seinfeld before, you are at an advantage. Just like with any of the dramas that we will be reading and watching over the course of the semester, if you have some familiarity with them, you have an advantage. But that doesn't mean that you shouldn't be rewatching and rereading, because each time you rewatch and you reread, you get new meaning. But the reason why I wanted you to watch the clip is to see how that contrasts with just reading in the actual script of The Pitch. And you can see that the actors really bring it to life. So there's that whole other level that occurs in drama when we're watching a performance. It's not just the screenplay if we're watching a film, and it is not just the play itself if we are reading a play, but it's the director and the actors, all those layers that we talked about when we were talking about Citizen Kane, that is applicable to any performance that we would watch on screen. So, elements of drama. Dramas tend to be divided up into sections. By their very nature, dramas are longer than short story. And they're similar to film in the sense that usually the expectations are about the same for length, that most audience members can sit for about 2 hours, give or take a little bit on either end. And because you're watching a drama live, that probably means that you've got to incorporate more, thought into what an audience can or cannot tolerate in one sitting. Elements of drama. Usually, dramas are divided into acts. Those are the main divisions of a play. And notice how we use those both words as synonyms, play and a drama. Drama, when you're enacting something, is playing, in effect. You're playing a role. You're playing a character, and it's supposed to be fun. Now, there are different genres with drama. Oftentimes, we talk about drama. There's too much drama in your life, that this is something that is serious. But within drama, we have different genres, such as comedy, for instance. And those main divisions of a play, acts, are divided into further divisions, or can be divided into further divisions, called scenes. And this would illustrate a change in location or character. Expect multiple plots, not just one plot as what we see with short story, but multiple plots. Secondary action to the main point, and those subplots are related to the main plot, even though they may not initially seem so. Stage direction, as I was indicating, the playwright's instruction to actors. And expect the kind of rise and fall of action, a sort of pyramid structure, which I think is true of all storytelling, but particularly with plays or dramas. If you think of it as a pyramid, on the left-hand side, bottom, that would be the beginning of action where we are introduced to characters. Then there's a rise in conflict. The top of the pyramid is the height of conflict. And then we get the beginning of descent as we go down the right side of the pyramid to finally the bottom right, which is resolution. In fact, when we get to Shakespearean drama, we'll talk about Shakespearean dramas being divided into 5 acts, and that the third act is very predictably at the top of the pyramid. That doesn't necessarily happen with all dramas, but it does happen with Shakespeare. And Shakespeare broke all the rules, that even though Shakespeare has a very predictive element in terms of what we can expect with rising and falling of action, and even genres. He wrote some plays that were comedies, and those had followed certain rules. He wrote some plays that were histories, and those followed certain rules, much like genre literature. Shakespeare was still creative. So on page 1115 and 1116, there's some questions you can ask yourself about drama when you're reading a drama. The good news is that these are similar questions that you would ask yourself when you are reading a short story or watching a film. So things like the setting and the actors and possible symbolism. In other words, everything that you were doing with Citizen Kane that you can transfer over to a dramatic performance. And the first drama we are going to read in its entirety is Oedipus the King. Now, you're given an example of a one-act drama in your textbook, which means it's a very short drama. It's called Trifles. And in fact, they even give you an example of how that one-act drama could be turned into a short story. And you'll see the differences in conventions between dramas, where you've got basically instructions to actors in a way that you wouldn't with short story. And of course, with short story, you have the possibility for doing things like narration, where you can have an omnipotent narrator, where you can have things like a character thinking to themselves. And yes, you can utilize these techniques in drama and film, but you need to figure out how to do it. So in terms of a character thinking, are you going to do that as a voiceover? Is the character going to be telling us what they're thinking? Is the character going to be sharing their thoughts through conversation? So it's a little bit more awkward than, let's say, when you are reading a novel or a short story. And Trifles is a great drama, actually. If you don't know what Trifles means, it means things that are unimportant or seemingly unimportant. And as we've talked about before, titles are so important. And The plot of that drama, as we find out in Trifles, is that there's a murder, and law enforcement is there, and they bring their wives. Note the date of the piece, because this will be illustrative of how gender would have been portrayed in the past. And while law enforcement is trying to find clues for the murder, the wives solve the murder by looking at trifles, seemingly unimportant clues, as they put together everything. That basically this was a situation of domestic abuse, and the abused wife has killed her husband in an abandoned farmhouse. All kinds of clues for this. The men aren't able to figure it out, and then the women have to decide should they share this information or not to the menfolk, and they decide they're going to keep it to themselves because the woman was abused, and they don't think it's their point to interfere, that she was just lashing back after her abuse. So I encourage you to read it if you haven't already read it. Unfortunately, it's in those set of readings that I cannot find online, though you may be able to find the drama itself, Trifles, online. But what I have been able to find online is the play that we will be beginning with in its entirety, Oedipus the King. So I wanted to talk a little bit about Oedipus the King, a play that was written in 430 BC Greece. So we're reading a translation, obviously. You're not expected to read it in the original. I have never read it in the original, so in my opinion, because I'm not fluent in Greek, I do not speak or read Greek. So in my opinion, I've never really read Oedipus the King. I've read many translations, some better than others. And Oedipus the King presents challenges. Not just that it's a translation. So if you've ever read a translation, you know the difficulty of being able to use another language in order to forward plot. But Oedipus the King was also written in poetry, and poetry is based on sounds. And the sounds in Greek language can be different than the sounds in English or whatever translation you're reading. So a translator is trying to balance the sounds and the lyricism of the poetry while also trying to give us the plot. And, it's an inexact science at best. But the good news is that when we read Oedipus the King, we are expected to already know the plot, because when Oedipus the King was performed in 430 BC Greece, audiences were expected to know the plot, which I will talk about shortly. So it's less about plot and more about some of the major themes in the play. So the author, Sophocles, in 400s BC, Athens, Greece. He was a statesman, he was a general, and he was also a dramatist. And luckily for us, his play still exists. And in fact, Oedipus the King, not only does it exist in its intact form, Oedipus is part of a trilogy, a 3-part story. We're reading just the first part, Oedipus. There is a second part that's called Antigone, and that I believe is included in your textbook. Certainly you can find it online too if you wanted to. Happens to be the story of Oedipus's adult daughter after she grows up. And then the last play in the trilogy is Oedipus at Colonus, where we return to the story of Oedipus, but this time Oedipus is an old man. The story we're reading, Oedipus the King, is Oedipus as a young man. So all 3 stories fit together, but you can read them as independent units. I kind of liken them to the Star Wars stories, where you can read them or watch them, I should say, as independent stories, but all of them tell a much greater saga. And they weren't necessarily created in chronological order, but you can put them in chronological order for the story. So, Sophocles is considered to be a great dramatist, in part because he used all of these innovations with drama. He added a 3rd actor on stage. Usually there were only 2 main actors and something called a chorus. And much like the chorus in a Broadway show, this would be a group of people who would all sing. Actually, they would chant the same lines, and they would all engage in the same movements. They would represent the community, almost like the extras in a movie, and could also serve as narration and narrate what was going on. Obviously, if everybody is chanting at the same time, that increases their volume. And one of the challenges of Greek drama in 430 BC is that they had to perform in Greek amphitheaters. And that means that they didn't have all of the modern conveniences we take for granted, such as electricity. So you don't have lighting, and more importantly, you don't have audio. So anything you can do to increase the volume, Though if you know anything about Greek amphitheaters, they are marvels in acoustics. And in fact, if you will see in the notes below, I have a 4-minute video for you to watch under section G about what a Greek amphitheater was like, to give you an idea. It could seat thousands, and basically there were rows of seats that were carved into the stone in a hillside. So there would be theatrical conventions that would need to be used just to increase audience visibility and audio. So the actors would be wearing basically these very large padded costumes. They would be wearing platform shoes to make them seem larger than life. And they would be wearing masks. And these masks would denote facial expressions. It would make it easier for us to differentiate one character from another. And again, it makes sense to have 2 characters on stage because it's easier to differentiate just 2 than 3. But what we have here with Sophocles is that he added a 3rd actor and reduced the role of the chorus. So theater is becoming much more contemporary, at least from their perspective. Theater at the time was not just for entertainment, it was also a religious festival to the god of wine and fertility. And as such, it was funded by the state because the government wanted to promote religious and community values. This was an opportunity for the community to gather together. And you would expect major themes such as hubris, excessive pride, and the consequences of having excessive pride. And what we should feel is a sense of catharsis as audience. And what that would mean is that we would feel pity and fear. In fact, Aristotle, who you might have heard of as a philosopher, was perhaps one of the first literary critics. And in fact, I gave you a brief reading to read from Aristotle, also a translation called On Tragic Character, where Aristotle talks about, in his opinion, and this is why I say he was perhaps the first literary critic, in his opinion, that Oedipus the King was the finest example of tragedy that had ever been written. And he gave elements of what should be included in a tragedy. It should be complex. Well, that makes sense. Any literature should be complex. It should be terrible. That makes sense because it's tragic. And it should be piteous. We should feel pity for the person experiencing the tragedy, who would be known as a tragic hero, a great man, above and beyond the ordinary, somebody beyond our capabilities, somebody we could admire and respect, who would experience a downfall. And that downfall would be 2-pronged. Part of it would be because of their flaw or flaws in character. That would be known as a tragic flaw or tragic flaws. So they help bring about their downfall. This is the instructional element to us. Hubris or excessive pride was usually one of their flaws, but they could have many others as well. But there also are outside forces, whether you want to call that fate, which is what they call it in the play, or you want to call that luck, or you want to call that destiny. Certainly philosophers and religious practices have tried to quantify and explain that idea of the outside force that is beyond our control. And that's one of the reasons why we pity the individual, and we feel pity when we see their fall, because yes, they are responsible, but up until a point, they're not completely responsible. And this individual, because they're good, above and beyond the ordinary, will take a level of responsibility for the errors that they've made. That's part of the reason why they are considered to be a tragic hero and heroic, because they're willing to accept responsibility. And that we feel as audience pity because it's not completely their fault, and also fear that if somebody this great could fall, we could fall just as easily and probably fall much further. And that these characters should be necessary and engage in probable actions. They should be as realistic as possible. So that said, Sophocles had identified Oedipus the King as perhaps the best example of tragedy. So that's one of the reasons why we still read Oedipus the King, even though it's so old, because of his historical importance in the tragic tradition. A tradition that other dramatists have followed. Probably Shakespeare is best known for his tragedies, Macbeth, Othello, King Lear, that all follow up to a point this formula that was established by Oedipus the King and that was identified by Aristotle. Though, of course, Shakespeare would change the rules a little bit to suit his dramatic purposes. Another reason why we read this play and why it's so important, even though it's so old and from a different time period, is because of Sigmund Freud. You might be familiar with Sigmund Freud's theory, the Oedipal complex, and it was a theory that Freud named very loosely based on the play Oedipus the King. And Freud's theory on the Oedipal complex is that young boys see their mothers as romantic possibilities and their fathers as rivals. There is also something that Freud calls an Electra complex, also loosely based on literature, that girls see their fathers, young girls, as romantic possibilities and see their mothers as competition. So, how is this loosely based on Oedipus the King? I had indicated that the audience would know the plot prior to the play. The text gives you the plot. I'm also going to give you the plot because when we watch Oedipus the King, it's important that we know the plot. If for no other reason, it might be difficult for us to absorb all of it if we were in a Greek amphitheater in 430 BC, even with the marvel of acoustics. Imagine the difficulty of being able to see and hear. Also, it's important because irony would be a major element in these plays, and it's important that we know what Oedipus does not know right from the very beginning of the play. And in fact, what we learn as we watch Oedipus unfold is that everybody figures out the answer except Oedipus. Oedipus is the last one to figure out the answer. We know the answer at the very beginning because we know the plot. So part of the fun of watching Oedipus the King, if I can use the word fun, is that you already know what the plot is. So it's about watching these actors interpret Oedipus the King and also watching the universal themes of questions like how much of our lives is based on free will and how much of our lives is fated or predestined or based on luck. Questions that we all have to grapple with, which is why the play is in some ways very contemporary, even though it's quite old. That's another reason why we still read Oedipus the King. So, after you watch the video about the Greek amphitheater, and after you've got a sense of drama, as I watched, or I asked you to watch a small snippet of Seinfeld, I think it'll make a lot more sense as to what we are going to be doing with Oedipus the King, but let me share the plot with you. So at this point, ideally, what should have happened is that you've read Oedipus the King in its entirety, even though we have multiple classes devoted to Oedipus the King, because we need to talk about the play and also watch performance as well. But I know life isn't always ideal. But what would be in your best interest is that if you haven't started reading Oedipus the King, definitely read Oedipus the King. And also, of course, you should be contemplating what it is you think you might want to do with the first paper. So, in terms of Oedipus the King, we begin in medias res, which means in the middle of the play. And Oedipus is basically confronted with this huge plague. His community is suffering. Keep in mind that this is a community that believes in the gods, in the plural, unlike our time where we believe in one god, usually. So Oedipus sends out all of these individuals to go speak to oracles, which would have been common at the time, to try to determine how they have offended the gods. The assumption is they've offended the gods, and that's why there's a plague. Everyone comes back with the same answer, including Oedipus's own brother-in-law, who Oedipus sent out to talk to Apollo, one of the gods. That Oedipus himself is responsible. Oedipus refuses to believe it, and he threatens individuals. He accuses them of treason, of trying to overthrow his kingdom, of lying. Ultimately, the truth comes to life as we hear some backstory, and what we find out is that, yes, Oedipus is indeed responsible, which, of course, we as audience would have already known prior to the play. So how is Oedipus responsible? This goes all the way back to Oedipus's birth, where his birth parents go to an oracle, which would have been basically common at the time, and the oracle tells Oedipus's birth parents that Oedipus will grow up to be a man who will kill his father, marry his mother. His parents are horrified and decide that what they need to do is to stop this prophecy from occurring. So they give the baby infant to, of course, an infant is a baby. They give the infant to a servant with instructions to kill the baby. The servant takes pity on the baby and abandons the baby. The baby happens to be found by another servant from another kingdom, and that servant takes that baby to his kingdom. It turns out the king and queen of that kingdom cannot have children. So they raise that baby as their own, and they never tell the baby that the baby is adopted. The baby eventually grows into a man. That man is Oedipus. And Oedipus is given a prophecy after he visits the prophet and the oracle, as was common during the time period, that he would eventually kill his father, marry his mother. Oedipus, of course, is horrified. Being a good man, he wants to prevent that at all costs. So what he decides to do is to go as far away as possible from his parents, not realizing that these are not his birth parents. These are his adopted parents. And on his journey, he comes at a crossroads. That's important symbolically. There's a chariot blocking Oedipus's way, and in a fit of anger, Oedipus kills everyone in the chariot. And it turns out one of the people in the chariot was Oedipus's biological father. And as a student of mine once indicated, perhaps this is the first or earliest example of literary road rage. Oedipus doesn't have a good reason for slaying everyone outside of Oedipus's anger. So if you've ever been angry in road rage situations, perhaps you can understand that. And then Oedipus continues along his travels. Again, he's trying to escape his parents, the people he thinks are his biological parents. And he ends up coming to a community that's ravaged by plague. In this instance, it's because of a monster called the Sphinx. And the Sphinx has a riddle. There's an old literary tradition of monsters having riddles, and you can't get rid of the monster until you solve the riddle. No one is able to solve the riddle, except Oedipus, showing Oedipus's intelligence. The riddle, actually, happens to be what walks on 4 legs in the morning, 2 legs in the afternoon, 3 in the evening. The answer is man. 4 legs in the morning is a baby crawling. 2 legs in the afternoon is an adult walking. 3 legs in the evening happens to be an elderly person with a cane. The community is so thrilled that Oedipus has defeated the Sphinx that they want to reward him. And it just so happens that the community has recently lost their king, who was killed. So Oedipus gets the kingdom and the newly widowed queen. And guess what? The newly widowed queen is, of course, Oedipus's birth mother. Not that the queen nor Oedipus know that. And they marry and they have children. And, of course, by marrying and having children, they offend the gods, which is why we get to the beginning of the play, Oedipus the King, where there is plague because the gods are offended about what Oedipus has done, not just engaging in an ancestral relationship, but trying to change his fate and outwit the gods, and which is exactly what Oedipus's birth parents did as well. So at this point, when the truth comes to light, Oedipus's birth mother slash wife, her name is Jocasta, is so horrified that she commits suicide. This would be seen as the easy way out, that she doesn't accept responsibility for her sins, so she can never be seen as a tragic character. Oedipus takes the brooches off of her dead body and gouges out his eyes, because vision and blindness is a major theme in the play. And now Oedipus is blind physically, but he has insight. He can see the truth. This is his way of punishing himself and accepting responsibility for his deeds. In fact, we're even introduced to a blind prophet in the play named Tiresias, who is physically blind but has insight. So now Oedipus is in the same place, physically blind but has insight, which goes to show that you can have eyes, but that doesn't mean that you can see the truth. And Oedipus is basically exiled from the community, and it turns out that Oedipus's brother-in-law is now going to be the king of the community. The brother-in-law's name is Creon, the person that Oedipus had accused of basically trying to overthrow the kingdom. And Creon said, "No, I'm not, and I don't want to be king. I don't want that kind of level of responsibility. I already have all the benefits of being part of the royal family." So in great irony now, it's Creon who is the king. And Oedipus wanders off blind, but with insight. And he wanders off with a cane, not because he's old, but because he's blind. So basically, Oedipus is the personification of the riddle as well. That's the story the audience would have already known. So when you actually see the story unfold and when you actually watch a performance, you know all of this ahead of time. The next piece, as I told you in the story, is Antigone, which happens to be the story of Oedipus's ancestral daughter, who is now an adult, and also Creon, who continues to be king, except no longer is Creon reasonable and rational the way he was in the first play prior to being king. He's filled with hubris and anger and passion, which makes you wonder, what does the position of king do to a person? That's the second play. And then the third play is Oedipus at Colonus, where Oedipus is an old man at this point, wandering around still in exile with his cane. Has he atoned for his sins, is the question of the third play. Will the gods forgive him? But we are focusing on the first play. So you can see I've given you the page numbers of where you can find that play in your textbook. But I've also included a link where you can access that play, because reading is in no substitution for watching a performance, nor is watching a performance any substitution for reading. The performance that we'll be talking about next class tries to duplicate as much as possible what we would have seen in a Greek theater in 430 BC. It will be very much unlike anything you have ever seen before. They are going to try to duplicate those big padded costumes with those masks and the exaggerated movements. In some ways, it's almost like watching a silent movie, if you've ever seen a silent movie. There will be chanting, and there will definitely be overacting. And again, you're not watching this performance for the plot. You've already known the plot. You're watching this performance for its dramatic interpretation. And while we are watching something that's filmed, I think they do a very nice job of giving us a sense of what we might have experienced in 430 BC. Obviously, we don't have witnesses to verify what we would experience in 430 BC. And I think it's a great piece in terms of some of the color imagery that I'll talk a little bit about after we watch that. And eventually, you'll have the opportunity to write a paper on drama, whether you are writing about the actual text itself or you're writing about performance, because we're going to see films of all three dramas that we will be reading. We're starting with Oedipus, and then we move to A Midsummer Night's Dream, and then finally we end with A Raisin in the Sun. And all three of these dramas we will read, but also watch film performances of. So that's what's coming up. But in terms of today's attendance question, I wanted to go back to our closing up on the fiction section. And it happens to be about Invisible Man. And what do you think is the significance of the Invisible Man's dream at the ending of the story? And as you know, you're not required to respond to your classmates, but you are required to read their responses, my responses in turn. I've fallen a little bit behind in responding to you, but I plan on catching up this week. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class with Oedipus the King. Take care. Bye-bye.